6 minutes each. Mr. Perkins, you'll lead us off, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Noseworthy. Mr. Noseworthy, when you were Assistant Deputy Minister at the Industry Department, you served as an observer on the board at SDTC for 6 years, I understand it, until I believe you retired in 2023. Is that correct?
Sir, first, I take issue with the word observer, which I believe implies a greater responsibility than I had. I was there at their invitation to offer information and nothing further. I withdrew from the board before I retired when we first became aware of the whistleblowers' allegations.
So,
and I believe that was
so you were there at the board's invitation. So your boss at the time, for most of that time, former Deputy Minister Newbley of the Industry Department, said he insisted that you be at the meetings as his eyes and ears. So are you incorrect in your assumption, or is he incorrect in what he told the committee?
Sir, I'm not sure these things are mutually exclusive. If you take a look at the board minutes, they clearly indicate I'm there at the invitation of the board.
I will take it that
Mr.
your immediate boss, the Deputy Minister, had the correct framing of what your role was, to be his eyes and ears, because he said not all Deputy Ministers agreed with that approach with agencies and boards, but he insisted on that in the ones that I said. So, since you were there to be his eyes and ears on what was going on, you must have had regular meetings with him about what was going on.
Mr. Chair, I spoke regularly to both Deputy Minister Nubley and Deputy Minister Kennedy when I was in my position. We carried discussion over a wide range of issues. SDTC would certainly come up when there was a matter of specific concern. With respect to Mr. Nubley, our key concerns were around the issues related to the implementation of the management action plan that came out of the evaluation of that organization in either 2017 or 2018, how to better see the organization integrate into policy on the federal side.
And then being the eyes and ears of your Deputy Minister in the Liberal Green Slush Fund, did you ever read the SDTC Act?
Yes, of course, sir, I did.
So then you with the clause on page 9 of the Act, on directors not to profit. It says, except as provided under subsection 1, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. Yet we know that the Auditor General has found that 9 directors, for a total of 82% of the transactions, were conflicted when money was voted to companies they had, representing $330 million in that alone. And then, of course, there's the $59 million that the Auditor General found that they voted for companies, some of which were their own, totally outside the contribution agreements which you referenced. So I would like to know, since you read the Act and you saw them voting for each other's companies, did you ever raise that with the Deputy Minister?
Sir, what I saw in front of me at SDTC was a regularly functioning board where people recused themselves where they thought there was a real reason to.
So I'll read it again because I don't see anywhere in the Act where it says it's okay to vote yourself property or investments if you recuse yourself. So let me read it again. Except as provided under subsection 1, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. When tens of millions of dollars were going to directors' funds, Andre-Lise Matteau, who you watched, vote $10.7 million by her own admission, and I'm not sure what was a level of conflict that would worry you, but $10.7 million to her own companies. The number's actually higher. When you saw Steve Kuchar, when you saw Gary Ouimet vote money for their own companies and have fellow directors vote them, total of $300 million, and you were sitting there 82% of the time. They began each meeting by outlining which director and which project was conflicted. You know, my friend here, his project's up, so he's conflicted, and my director here, so he'll just get out and recuse himself. And you sat in those meetings 82% of the time when things were happening, and you never reported that to your boss?
Sir, I had no way of independently assessing conflicts of interest by the board, specifically with the interpretation that you are applying to the Act. I am not a lawyer.
Interpretation, I'll do it again, except as provided under subsection 1. That's not very complicated. No director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property. That's not tough. You don't have to be a lawyer. Even a bureaucrat could figure out that that means you cannot vote for your own companies to receive money from the board you're on. It's against the Act. You, sir, were responsible for being the eyes and ears of the deputy in that meeting. And I just don't believe that you never told them that these things were going on. Like, who are you covering up for?
Mr. Chair, I had very limited information upon which to look at issues of conflict of interest.
Said this director has a conflict, and then that director gets the money, and then the next director gets the money, and you're sitting in the meeting. What? That's not information to report back?
I had no way to independently assess, Mr. Chair. I had no way to independently assess, Mr. Chair, what holdings individual board members had.
Round off. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Noseworthy, you were ISED's eyes and ears at the SDTC board, attending each and every board meeting in which there were 186 conflicts of interest involving board members. The Auditor General identified 90 instances in which the conflict of interest policy was not complied with. There were multiple real conflicts of interest, including tens of millions of dollars that were funneled from SDTC to companies in which board members had interests. And your excuse for supposedly saying nothing, doing nothing, and reporting nothing back is that you had no independent way of assessing conflicts of interest. Really? How can you assert that when the evidence was right in front of you?
The fiduciary responsibility on conflict of interest rests with the member of the board. It is the responsibility of the
Mr.
organization
Noseworthy,
to
you made the statement that you had no independent way of assessing conflicts of interest, and I put it to you that that is false. The evidence was right in front of you, wasn't it? Because, Mr. Noseworthy, this committee has heard plenty of evidence about the fact that weeks before each board meeting, an agenda was sent out. Board members were invited to identify which projects they had conflicts of interest in, and at the beginning of the meeting, the secretary would read out which projects involving which directors conflicts of interest existed. And you said nothing, you did nothing, you covered it up. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chair, I only saw the materials that were circulated for
Yeah, and the materials provided, certain members had conflicts of interest. And it was said at the beginning of the meeting. So what are you talking about that you had no independent way of assessing? You're just making it up.
They declared it.
You're making it up to cover your butt.
Mr. Chair, when people declared conflict of interest and it was raised at the beginning of the meeting, my experience was that they recused themselves and they were not part of the discussion on the project.
So they left the room. Did they leave the room? Because recusing oneself is not sufficient. But even if they did leave the room, that's not acceptable either, is it? Because Section 12 of the SDTC Act states very clearly that no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. One such board member, the good friend of the Environment Minister, Andre Lise-Matteau, admitted before this committee that $10.4 million was funneled from SDTC into companies that she had interests, and that is a complete violation of the SDTC Act. Yes, she declared the conflict. Yes, she left the room. You were at each of those meetings. Why didn't you report these blatant violations of the SDTC Act? You were aware of the Act. You admitted you were aware of the Act. Why didn't you report $10.4 million funneled into her companies improperly and illegally?
Mr. Chair, my experience again, sorry, there seems to have been some feedback. Mr. Chair, my experience was that people recused themselves, and my assumption was by recusing themselves and following normal board procedures, they would have been in compliance with the
What
rules.
part of Section 12.2, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property, do you not understand?
I am not a lawyer, sir, and Mr. Chair, I believe that that clause needs to be read in reflection on what the general rules and procedures
$10.4
of
million
boards exist.
going
Point
into
of order,
companies
Mr. Chair.
that Andre Lee's Mateau
Mr.
had
Cooper,
interests in.
Mr. Cooper, just I have a point of order. Yes, Ms. Khalid.
Chair, we've spent a lot of months and years trying to make sure that our interpreters are well taken care of. We don't need to yell that loudly when we're talking into a microphone, because I do believe that it is hurting their ears. So, Chair, if you can, if you can please, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, I was hearing Miss Khalid. It's all right, Mr. Durain. I appreciate your concern. It's one I share. Mr. Cooper, you have about 40 seconds left, and I would urge you just to be aware of the interpreters. I see where you're going, and I know the committee members share your concerns, but if you could just keep that in mind, you have 40 seconds, please.
Well, Mr. Noseworthy, what were you doing at each of these meetings? Eating chicken fingers? I mean, what were you doing?
Mr. Chair, as I've now indicated multiple times, I saw my role there as around policy coordination and providing board members with advice that they might find useful in policy coordination and ultimately making decisions around the organization.
Thank you very much. Up next.
I began work with Mr. Nubley in 2016.
Just a simple
17.
answer, please. How many years, please?
Yeah, I'm just trying to work it out in my head, sir. My apologies. I believe about 5 years, 4 or 5 years.
So let me ask you, he stated that you met often and that he was your eyes and ears on the board. Did you bring up the issue of the conflicts with him at all? You obviously worked together a long time. You met many times together. The whole public service operates under the basic and the guiding principle of risk aversion and CYA, and you know what the A stands for, basically cover your backside. So did you bring this up, these conflict issues, with the deputy minister?
Mr. Chair, if conflict issues had become apparent to me or were made apparent to me by SDTC, I would have immediately raised them with the deputy minister.
So you didn't raise anything. Now, I'm going to ask, we had Ms. Colbeck, who's the vice president, with us on Monday. She, like you, like Mr. Norbley and everyone else, seems to been completely, like Tommy Rockhopper, blind, deaf, and dumb to the conflicts of interest. Stating, accepting no accountability or responsibility, but she did state that conflicts were minuted from the board meetings that you were at. And yet you seem to be saying that there were no conflicts that you were aware of. Could you explain that to us, please?
My understanding is that when a conflict
Your understanding, I'm asking a simple question. The vice president, Ms. Colbeck, stated the conflicts were minuted at the meeting you were at. You were at all the meetings. She stated the conflicts were minuted. So you were at this meeting, so conflicts were discussed. What did you do with those conflicts?
When I became aware of the conflicts that were minuted and they were dealt with in due process, I saw no need to bring them further. It was a matter within the purview of the organization and its conflict of interest.
You talked about your role being ensuring the administration of the contribution agreement. Article 20.03 of the contribution agreement states very clearly that conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest have to be reported to the Minister of Industry. So you're aware of these conflicts. You were there to administer the oversight of the contribution agreements. Did you report these conflicts, as you were required to in the contribution agreement, Article 20.03, did you report these to the Minister?
Mr. Chair, my understanding of the
I'm not asking your
contribution
understanding. I'm asking, did you do your job? You stated you were there for the administration of the contribution agreement. The contribution agreement states very clearly conflicts of interest have to be reported to the Minister. Did you?
By the organization, sir. By
No.
the organization.
Right, so you thought, oh, it's someone else's job. Even though you stated you were there to ensure the administration of the contribution agreement. But that's not your job. You knew about the conflict, but it's not your job.
I saw my responsibility as I have stated here. I had seen any deviation from conflict of interest obligations. As I've indicated, I would have reported them. I saw it as the obligation on the organization to report to the minister because that's what the contribution agreement
It's his job to do it. $400 million, the taxpayers' money, but it's someone else's job to do it, and you were aware of it, but it's someone else's job. We had I mentioned before to Ms. Colbeck, we had a low-level or lower-level person in the public service brave enough to be a whistleblower and come forward to you as well. But you didn't have that bravery, and you didn't see it as your job for oversight, even though you stated earlier today that part of your role was to ensure the administration of the contribution agreement. But I guess not necessarily.
Mr.
Is
Chair,
that what
the whistleblower never came to me. I'm not aware of the work of the whistleblower, and I never spoke to that
I
person.
think it was your role as an ADM who does have fiduciary duties under the Financial Administration Act to act on this. You just thought it was someone else's job. Like who should have done that then?
As I've indicated, I saw the responsibility on
Let me-
reporting conflicts of
just
interest.
ask
Mr. McCauley, you're out of time, but why don't, that's a pertinent question. Whose job was it? Why don't you answer that, Mr. Noseworthy, and then we'll move on.
Yes, as I was saying, that I saw that as an obligation of the organization to report to the minister consistent with the terms of the contribution agreement.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Noseworthy, I'm extremely disappointed in your responses because your version of events simply do not add up. You talk about the conflict of interest component, that you weren't in a position to assess it. But the fact of the matter is the board members declared the conflict of interest. According to your evidence, from time to time, recused themselves. So before I get to the fullness of the question, I want to be satisfied that you understand what recusal means. What do you think that means?
Recusal, sir, is that I saw the individuals depart the room and not participate in any further discussion.
Right. So the evidence is very clear, as revealed in the Auditor General's report, that while you were in attendance at the majority, if not all, of the board meetings, conflicts of interest were declared. Sometimes people had left, but the evidence is clear that those conflicted directors, those liberal conflicted directors, including the hand-picked Liberal chair, Annette Verschuren, voted in favor of lining their own pockets and their companies in your presence. And your fantastical evidence today seems to suggest that you had no moral, ethical, and or legal obligation to report that to the Deputy Minister and ultimately to the Minister. No one, sir, believes that. You are a senior public servant, and I would hope you have the best interests of the taxpayer in mind. This massive scandal has cost the taxpayers well over $400 million. Your evidence, sir, of remaining essentially mute because your belief, pursuant to the contribution agreement, is that the board was to report these conflicts, which clearly they didn't, does not absolve you, sir, of your responsibility. You were extremely negligent. So the gig is up, and I don't know who you're trying to protect, but do you have anything to say about your lack of respect for the Canadian taxpayer, sir?
Mr. Chair, when I saw potential conflicts of interest, I saw people recuse themselves, and I saw nothing to report.
On your last occasion, sir, you lied. You claimed that Annette Verschuren at all times conducted herself completely appropriately. That is an absolute lie. In the words of Annette Verschuren herself, after she was outed by the Auditor General, by the Ethics Commissioner, she was found guilty by not recusing herself, by not leaving the boardroom in your presence. Why did you lie to us?
I do not recall that circumstance.
You do not recall the circumstance. How convenient. Do you have a problem with your memory generally or just specifically when you're asked tough questions?
I'm not sure that is an appropriate answer to that question.
Because you're caught in a lie.
Mr. Brock, that is your time. I'm now going to go.